She's just a nurse, the administrator said, loud enough for the whole trauma bay to hear. The wounded captain on the table, barely conscious, barely breathing, opened his eyes at the sound of her voice and said something that made every single person in that room go completely silent. He called her by a rank 3 levels above anyone else standing there. Nobody at that hospital had any idea who they'd actually hired until the truth walked in wearing a uniform instead of scrubs. Hey everyone, welcome back to Nurse Files, the channel where the quiet ones in the room usually outrank everyone standing over them. If this is your first time here, go ahead and hit subscribe, drop a like, and let me know where you're watching from tonight. Let's get into it. Fort Callahan Regional Medical Center sat just outside the base perimeter, close enough to handle military overflow, civilian enough that its administration liked to pretend rank stopped meaning anything the moment a patient crossed the threshold. Alice Monroe had worked there for 7 months. She was 44, dark hair streaked lightly with gray and pulled into a tight, no-nonsense bun, posture so straight it looked almost military, though nobody at Fort Callahan had ever bothered to ask why. She spoke rarely, worked precisely, and carried herself with a quiet authority that most people mistook for simple professionalism. Nobody knew where she'd worked before Fort Callahan. Her file listed prior clinical experience as extensive classified assignment. Administration had approved her hiring without reading past the first line. "She's efficient, but she's got an attitude problem," said Gerald Finch, the hospital's chief administrator, reviewing staff evaluations with visible irritation one morning. "Doesn't defer properly to physicians, corrects people. I've had 2 doctors complain about her tone this month alone." "Her tone or her being right?" asked Nurse Patricia Alvarez, one of the few people at Fort Callahan who actually respected Alice. "Doesn't matter which," said Finch. "There's a chain of command here, Alvarez, and Monroe seems to think she's exempt from it." Dr. Trevor Lang, the ER's ambitious young attending, agreed completely. 39, sharply dressed even under his white coat, the kind of doctor who treated his authority like something that needed constant visible reinforcement. "Monroe, you're on general intake tonight. Try to remember your support staff, not a physician. I don't need commentary on my treatment plans." "Understood, doctor." "That's all? No pushback?" Lang seemed faintly disappointed, the way men like him often were when nobody gave them a reason to feel important. Alice said nothing. She simply nodded and continued her intake rounds with the same quiet precision she brought to every shift, 7 months of small dismissals settling into a place that had long since stopped affecting her composure. She'd learned in another life entirely that titles given by strangers meant far less than the ones earned in rooms where the stakes were actually life and death. Being called just a nurse cost her nothing. It simply meant fewer people watched closely enough to notice what she was actually capable of. "Doctor now," Alice said, no longer a suggestion. "Fine," Lang snapped, moving to comply, though his hands moved with less certainty than his usual confident being. That evening, word came through that a military transport was inbound with a critical casualty, a captain injured during a training accident at the base, requiring immediate trauma care. "All hands to the trauma bay," Finch announced, sweeping through the ER with the energy of a man eager to demonstrate his hospital's competence to visiting military liaisons. "Lang, you're leading. Monroe, general support only. Vitals, paperwork, nothing hands-on with this one. I want our best face forward tonight." "Understood," Alice said. "I mean it, Monroe," Finch added, unable to resist one more small dig. "This is a captain. I don't need a nurse's opinions complicating things in front of military liaisons." Alice's expression didn't change. She simply moved to her assigned position and waited, the same quiet readiness she'd carried into every shift for 7 months, unaware yet of exactly how personally this particular patient's arrival was about to matter. The trauma bay doors burst open at 9:17 p.m. Captain Daniel Reyes arrived unconscious, his uniform torn and bloodied, a training exercise malfunction having left him with a serious chest injury and significant blood loss. 2 military medics accompanied the gurney, their expressions tight with the particular urgency of people who'd already done everything they could in the field. Multiple rib fractures, suspected pneumothorax, hypotensive and dropping, one medic reported rapidly. We stabilized what we could in transport, but he needs immediate intervention. Dr. Lang moved into action, barking orders with practiced confidence. Finch hovering nearby to greet the accompanying military liaison officer with visible eagerness. Get me imaging, now. Monroe, vitals only. Stay out of the primary assessment. Understood, Doctor. Alice took her position exactly as instructed, monitoring vitals with quiet efficiency while Lang began his assessment. But something in her posture had changed, a stillness that hadn't been there a moment before. Her eyes tracking Captain Reyes's face with an intensity that went far beyond routine vitals monitoring. "Pressure's dropping fast," Alice said, her voice carrying an edge of urgency that made Lang glance up, mildly annoyed at the interruption. "I'm aware, Monroe. I'm assessing." "Doctor, his breath sounds are asymmetric on the left and his trachea's deviating. That's not just a pneumothorax developing, that's tension building fast. He needs decompression before imaging, not after." "I'll determine the treatment plan, Monroe," Lang said, tension entering his own voice now. "You were told vitals only." "With respect, Doctor, vitals are telling me he doesn't have time for a debate about roles," Alice said, her calm unshaken despite the growing urgency in the room. Lang hesitated, torn between irritation and the creeping awareness that the numbers on the monitor were, in fact, confirming exactly what Alice had said. Captain Reyes's oxygen saturation dropped sharply, an alarm sounding as his breathing grew visibly labored. Dr. Lang said he needed a 14 gauge, and these words came out with enough conviction that Alice already had it in hand before he finished the sentence. Together, they worked through the escalating crisis, Lang performing the procedure with Alice's steady guidance keeping the pace exact, precise, unhurried, despite the very real danger unfolding in front of the watching military liaison officer and Finch, both of whom had gone very quiet as the severity of the situation became impossible to downplay. Within minutes, Captain Reyes's breathing eased, his oxygen levels climbing back toward stable, color slowly returning to a face that had gone alarmingly gray moments before. As his consciousness began to surface, his eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found Alice's face above him. "Monroe," he rasped, voice weak but unmistakably clear. "Colonel Monroe." The room went utterly silent. "Sir, you're confused," Dr. Lang started to say, still catching his breath from the intervention. "This is Nurse Monroe." "I know exactly who this is," Captain Reyes said, stronger now, his eyes never leaving Alice's face. "I served under her for 2 tours. She commanded forward medical operations for the entire regional task force. Colonel Alice Monroe." "Ma'am, I didn't know you were stationed here." Finch's face had gone pale. "Colonel," he repeated slowly, disbelief warring with the sudden sinking realization of exactly what he said to her and about her only hours earlier. "You're telling me she's a—"
"Retired Colonel, United States Army," the military liaison officer confirmed, stepping forward now, his own posture straightening with sudden recognition. "I remember the name from operational briefings years ago. Colonel Monroe ran some of the most effective forward trauma units in the regional command. I had no idea she was working here." "I wasn't advertising it," Alice said quietly, still monitoring Captain Reyes's vitals with the same steady calm she'd shown all night. "I retired to help people without the weight of command deciding how they saw me first." Dr. Lang stood frozen, the reality of the last 20 minutes rearranging itself entirely in his mind. "You corrected my assessment," he said slowly. "You were right. I almost—" He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. "You almost delayed a decompression that Captain Reyes didn't have time to wait for," Alice said, no cruelty in her voice, only fact. "I raised my voice because there wasn't a version of tonight where staying quiet ended well for him." Finch, still pale, seemed to search for something to say and came up empty. The words, "just a nurse," hung in the air between them all, now unspoken, but impossible to unhear. The formal hospital review convened 2 days later, not to discipline Alice, though Finch initially framed it that way, but because a nurse overriding a doctor's treatment sequence during an act of trauma required documentation under Fort Callahan's protocols, regardless of the outcome or the patient's gratitude. "Ms. Monroe," said Dr. Renata Osei, the hospital's chief medical officer, reviewing the incident with careful neutrality. "You challenged Dr. Lang's treatment sequence during an act of emergency. Whatever the outcome, that's a deviation from your role here." "It is," Alice said. "I'd do it again." "That's quite direct, given the circumstances." "It's the truth, Doctor. Captain Reyes needed decompression before imaging. Dr. Lang was moving toward the wrong sequence. I corrected that in real time because the alternative was watching a patient's condition deteriorate while everyone waited for permission to say what the monitor was already showing." Dr. Lang, seated at the table, spoke before Osei could respond. "The review should reflect what actually happened, Doctor. I hesitated. Ms. Monroe didn't. If she'd stayed silent the way Mr. Finch instructed her to, we'd likely be discussing Captain Reyes's death tonight instead of his recovery." Finch shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "I wasn't aware of her background at the time." "That," Osei said evenly, "is precisely the point, Mr. Finch. You shouldn't have needed to know her rank to trust her judgment. You needed a crashing patient to show you what her competence already looked like. And even then, your first instinct was to silence her, not listen to her." Osei turned back to Alice. "I reviewed your service record last night, Colonel. 2 decades of distinguished service, command of forward trauma operations across multiple deployments, decorations that most physicians in this building will never come close to earning. Why did none of that appear in your civilian file here?" "Because I didn't want it to," Alice said quietly. "I wanted to help people without my rank walking into every room ahead of me." "And instead," Osei said, "we very nearly let ego decide the outcome of a young captain's life because nobody thought a quiet nurse's opinion was worth listening to before a name was attached to it first." Finch had no response. "This review is closed with commendation," Osei said. "Effective immediately, I'm implementing a policy requiring staff with prior specialized service to be formally acknowledged in role assignments, so competence isn't left to hide behind assumptions again." Patricia, sitting quietly near the back of the room, wiped her eyes and said nothing at all, though her expression carried everything her silence couldn't. The trouble that followed arrived from an unexpected direction less than a week later. A man claiming to be a journalist began calling the hospital repeatedly, asking increasingly specific questions about the colonel working as a nurse, questions that grew stranger with each call. By the 4th day, hospital security flagged an unauthorized vehicle circling the staff parking area repeatedly, and by evening, a man matching the vehicle's description was caught attempting to access restricted records near the ER's rear entrance. "It's not a journalist," Alice said, watching the security footage over a technician's shoulder, old instincts sharpening instantly. "Journalists don't case rear entrances at night." Security caught the man moments later, agitated and unwilling to explain himself clearly, muttering about exposure and consequences connected to a benefits dispute he claimed had been mishandled under Alice's old command years earlier. Alice arrived at the security office calmly, her presence immediately steadying the tense standoff between the agitated man and 2 uncertain security guards. "I'll talk to him," she said simply. "Ma'am, that's not standard protocol," one guard said. "Neither is a man circling this hospital for 4 days building up the nerve to do something he can't take back," Alice said. "Let me try the version of this that doesn't end in an arrest report nobody actually wants to write." She sat across from him in a quiet security office, her calm presence gradually working past his agitation the way it had worked past far more dangerous confrontations in another life entirely. "You don't know what your old command cost people like me," the man said, voice shaking with old grievance. Then tell me, Alice said, exactly what happened and exactly what you believe went wrong. I owe you that conversation, whether or not I was the one who made the original decision. Over the next hour, in a quiet, unremarkable room, Alice listened to a genuine grievance about a benefits case gone wrong years earlier. Not resolving it entirely, but ensuring by the end of the conversation that it would finally reach the right desk instead of being buried under bureaucratic silence for another decade. Nobody ever just listened before, the man said quietly, as security finally let him leave without incident, his complaint formally logged for real review instead of dismissal. Then I'm glad I was here to be the first, Alice said. Fort Callahan Regional Medical Center changed in the months that followed, in ways both large and quietly permanent. Gerald Finch, humbled in a way that visibly reshaped his approach to staff, began personally reviewing every dismissive comment he was tempted to make before it left his mouth, not perfectly, but consistently enough that people noticed. Dr. Lang requested ongoing mentorship from Alice, slowly becoming known throughout the ER for asking questions before issuing orders, especially to the nurses working closest to the patients in front of him. Patricia and Alice grew into an honest friendship, built finally on truth instead of assumption. Captain Reyes, recovering steadily, visited often during his follow-up appointments, always finding Alice first, always addressing her with the same quiet respect that had started it all. And Alice Monroe kept working her same steady shifts in the same simple scrubs, her posture just as straight as it had always been. Except now, when people at Fort Callahan looked at her, they finally saw exactly who had been standing in front of them all along. She hadn't needed anyone to say her old rank aloud to know its weight, but now that they had, she understood something she'd nearly let herself forget. Being called just anything does not make it true. Rank without recognition is still rank. Quiet without respect is still strength. Listen before you label. The truest leaders rarely correct the room twice. They simply do what's right once, clearly, and let the silence afterward speak for itself. The end. This story is fictional and created for entertainment purposes only.